Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host.
Quiet on the set.
Welcome back for another episode in our Oscar series, with in-depth looks at the nominees in the technical categories. This is episode 8 of 13, and today we're talking about Best Animated Feature Film. Happy to welcome back returning guests. First, Kent Seki. You're a 20-year Hollywood veteran, and your animated credits include Megamind, The Boss Baby, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem. Nice to see you again.
It's great to see you, Skid. Happy to be back.
Next, Camille Leganza. You've been working on animated films for more than 20 years with credits including The Incredibles, The Secret of Kells, and The Iron Giant. Classics all. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Skid. It's great to see you both.
Oh, this is going to be fun, but as listeners know, before we get to the films, I want to take a moment and once again reflect on the LA wildfires. The fires are contained, but so many are still dealing with the aftermath. To all of our industry colleagues and everyone affected, we see you. Okay, here we go. The 2024 nominees for Best Animated Feature Film are Flow, Inside Out 2, Memoir of a Snail, Wallace and Gromit, Vengeance Most Fowl, and The Wild Robot. We're going to discuss them in that order, and spoilers are possible, so consider this a warning. Last note, I'm going to recognize the nominated artists by name, but apologies in advance if I mangle any of them. Kent and Camille, please correct me if you catch any errors. First up, Flow. The nominated team is Ginst, Zabalotis, Matisse Kaza, Ron Darians, and Gregory Zockman. Is that even close to correct? Yeah. Okay. Well, take it away, guys. Save me from myself, please. Let's start talking about the movie.
Okay. The first film, Flow. What an exciting film to have included in this category. I loved it. I think it's a really standout film for a lot of different reasons. It's Latvian, it's European co-pro, very low budget, but beautiful. There's no dialogue, so there's no big stars attached. And the way that it was made in Blender, which I would love to hear your take on this, Kent, because you are definitely more technical than I am. But I think it's just such a beautiful film, very bizarre, about a cat. Watched it with my daughter. And my only pro tip is if you do watch this, please stay through the credits because it will change how you view the film as a whole. Because I ended it early and I was very sad, and so was my daughter. And then I looked online and I was like, what was that? And then I read an article that said, oh, make sure you stay for the end credit scene.
Yes. Like a Marvel movie, there's a post-credit scene that makes things a little bit more right. Let's just say that.
Yeah. So I was like, okay, we got to turn it back on and watch the last scene. And that redeemed it for my daughter, because my daughter was like, oh my God.
How can I have the rest of my day now?
But yeah, it was great. But yeah, I would love to hear your take, Kent, because it was made in Blender.
Yes. So for those who don't know, Blender is a free open source software. I've been asked about Blender throughout my career, and it's been well known in the digital animation or CG animation circles because it is open source, and it's always had a great renderer, meaning the images that come out of it are pretty fantastic, and the way that it renders the image and paints the frame, so to speak, for the final frames is pretty great. It's pretty sophisticated. But more recently, it's gotten more and more sophisticated overall, to the point where I've seen many people switching into Blender in their personal use at home. All the rest of the 3D software used professionally is you have to buy it, you have to purchase it, and it can be very expensive. But being open source and free, I've been asked about it from many students, like, what do you think of Blender? And my response has always been the same, which is, I think Blender is great. It's always good to have an open source software because it allows people to experiment and do things. But learning software is hard for me. It takes a long time to become an expert in a piece of software. And I said, when they make a movie in Blender with a full team, then I'll start investigating that more closely. And lo and behold, here is this film. And it takes advantage of the open source software. There's a lot of water in this movie. It's a, quote, post-diluvial Earth. I've never heard post-diluvial, but it's like a flooded Earth. if you don't know what that means. So, and the team that made this used a new or developed a water shader called Physical Open Water, and it was also made in Latvia by a guy. I'm gonna butcher this name, Martins Apudis, I think, or Apudis, I think is his name. The filmmaker happened to meet this guy, and oh, he's online first, and then he's like, oh, he's in Latvia also, and they met in person, and he joined the team. And now you can buy that water shader for $50 on the Blender market. Like that's sort of encapsulates probably in a little bit of a nutshell of what Blender is about. It's about a community. It's about making stuff together. And it sort of cuts out this idea of like super expensive architecture. I mean, you obviously need to develop some things if you want to work with a lot of people, but it's a little bit of a throwback in terms of like being able to be scrappy and make a film. And I think it's pretty extraordinary that it was made in Blender. I mean, really hats off to the filmmakers to take on such a task. The last film that Gintz made was in Maya, which is the standard sort of 3D software that most companies use to make their DCP, so to speak.
When I read that Gintz, and again, I am so sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. I read that he basically taught himself Blender kind of over the course of making this film, because I think it took 5 years.
5.5 years.
Five
Yes,
and a
that's what I
half,
read the
yeah.
same thing. 5.5 years to make this movie.
And I think a very small team, like over that course of
Yeah.
time.
I
So,
think usually it's hundreds of people, but I think it was far fewer than that to make this. Yeah.
but it's very interesting. I mean, it's kind of a well, what did you say? Post-diluvial?
Post-diluvial. I don't.
Post-diluvial, because it is kind of post-apocalyptic because you never see humans. It's
You
all
see
about
remnants of the
animals.
humans, right? Like buildings and things like
Remnants.
this. Yeah.
Yeah, so humans at one point were there, but it really is about the animals, and I think the strength of this film is really in the relationship between those animals, because you're with them, from the first scene with the cat, kind of figuring things out, and the dog, and then a lot of exciting things happen after that. Uh, no spoilers for me. Um, it was such a great film because really to have an animated film with animals, no dialogue from Latvia, like that is not something that I
I didn't
think.
have that on my bingo card for this year when I thought about it
Yeah,
coming up. Yeah, before this movie came out. Like that's an extraordinary achievement for this, and it's won awards. It's
yeah,
it's
it's
it's won.
beautiful.
It's an kind of an amazing thing that it's this year's Flea. If you go back a couple of years to when Flea came out, it's nominated for both animated and international feature. So it's pulled off that one, and one hopes that that doesn't nix it from either. Like you want it to have the contention in both categories. It's premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, made a splash there. It screened again at Annecy and won the jury prize and the audience award. It's Janice's highest grossing film in the US at 3.9 million. So the independent production and distribution company. So like it's like kind of defied the odds to get
Yeah.
here. And like that's pretty amazing for it. And also, it should be noted the animals are not anthropomorphic. They are animated realistically. And I think the animation on the cat, I remember just being mesmerized by the animation of the cat. I think it's really well done. And I think the choice to make a gray cat is really interesting. I think it's hard. That choice is hard from a lighting perspective
Mhm.
because there are scenes in which it goes in and out of light, and it's like it sometimes looks milky and sometimes it changes color a little bit to me watching it with a critical eye, not to the point where it takes you out of the movie, but I think that's very challenging in a lighting condition that changes. I think that makes it very hard. I remember thinking the cat was black at first when I saw some of the posters in the early bit, but then I read a line, it's a gray cat. So I think that's an interesting choice because I think it's hard to do that well. And the cat's constantly getting wet and dry. So that is another difficult thing to do. Well, we talked about it in the visual effects side of it in Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. So I think technically there's a lot of things it's doing that are very hard.
Yeah, water is always very, very challenging.
I have a question for the two of you, and the idea of this open source software being used to make the movie. I had a little bit of trouble getting into the film from the beginning because it looked to me like I was in a video game. And there's something about
Oh,
the rendering that was just
yep.
a little not as polished as I'm used to seeing on, the big screen. Now, as I went in, I forgot about that. And you were talking about, I think, the characterization and the way the animals are not anthropomorphic yet manage to have these relationships. And then there are scenes later on where the water effects and some of the other lighting effects really go next level, and I was legitimately wowed. But from the beginning, it took a while to hook me, and I'm wondering, is that a consequence of using the Blender software, or I don't know. I'm trying to think what would have happened if a studio had come along and given me more of a hook from the beginning. But then would we have ended up with a completely different movie or just different technology behind it? I'm interested in hearing your thoughts from both the technical and creative side, how those merge.
I don't think that the look is a function of Blender. That's a conscious choice where they did the what we call flat shading. It's like cartoon shading on the characters, but more photorealism on like the environments. And I think that's a conscious choice. And it can be, I think it can, for obviously with you as just watching it straight up, it took you out for a little bit, and then the movie itself brought you in. One could argue it's a feature, not a bug, in terms of like what they were going for. I've seen movies like that done before, and sometimes it is a limitation of the technology, but I don't believe this was like Blender can do fully photoreal on its own without it, but I think they wanted something that made it look different. And I think it's this whole movement we've had recently, and we call it the Spider-Verse effect, where people are exploring different looks and different combinations of the way things look.
I absolutely agree. I was going to say, like, it's that stylization, the choices that they made in the art direction and production design that is that kind of more handcrafted movement, based on, what, like Kent said, the Spider-Verse effect, and just different studios exploring different looks, that are kind of reflecting back on the overall history of animation and the handcraftedness and just different styles, painterly, those kinds of looks. And I agree. I mean, I think, when it started, I wasn't sure. I hadn't read anything about it. I didn't know anything about it, and so I wasn't sure kind of the look going in, but it drew me in, and I agree. Like, it did kind of have maybe the rendering of a video game. I could see where you're coming from, Skid, but it does take you away. I think it really gets you in that world. And when you see the remnants of whatever human civilization that was, I mean, there's just so many questions that come up from the watching of this film, and none of them are answered, which I think is really beautiful, because it's not tied up in a bow where you end the film and you're like, well, okay, now I understand what happened to like the entire
Right.
Human race.
human race. Like, who knows, because I didn't know, like, is this cat gonna find whatever person was there in the house that
Yeah.
that it starts out
It
in,
starts off in with the drawings, like there's all this
yeah,
stuff that's happening in the beginning that you think will resolve it doesn't, and in a good way. And I think that
yeah,
that's pretty
yeah.
extraordinary. I actually draw a real comparison between this and the Wild Robot, which we'll talk about
Mm.
later. In many ways, this is the indie version of the Wild Robot, even though there's no robots in it. I just think there's something about this, about nature and about a world that isn't a human world, that really you have the big studio approach of the Wild Robot and you have the indie approach of Flow, and both are being rewarded this year. And I think that I like that. I think that that's a great thing. This movie, I think, is very moving in a way that like
Hmm.
it really captures your attention. And if you can get past, if you initially, and I think this is what's great about what you're saying, Skid, is that at first you're a little bit like, whoa, what's going on here? But then as the movie progressed, you sort of forgot about it, right? And so I think that's maybe similar when we talked about Better Man and you see a chimpanzee playing Robert Williams. You're like, well, this is kind of weird. And then after some point you forget, and that's when the film is extraordinary to me, is like you do forget the things that maybe aren't as successful for you personally, and then you just watch the movie.
Well, the film does get my endorsement. Yeah, it's an experience worth chasing. Although, as Camille pointed out, you should stay through the credits.
Yes, please. That's pro tip. Don't be me.
Pro tip. Also, all the animals are real animals, but there's a whale character that's like this kind of hybrid mutated whale that's like that. I found that choice to be interesting. It's like that the rest of the animals are like, oh, that's a capybara, and that's a Labrador, and that's a bird, that's a lemur. But then the whale is kind of this fantastical whale. So that choice was, I thought that was really interesting by the director to choose to do that. Like, well, we're gonna make the whale a little bit different, kind of thing.
And a little psychedelic moment in there too, which was very interesting.
Yeah, yeah,
Because again, like
100%.
I had a lot of questions. I was like, what is happening? happening? Um, but it doesn't answer those questions. And so you
Yeah.
really walk away kind of with your own interpretation. And I think that there's something really beautiful about that. And you kind of take away from the story something personal
Yeah.
and what it means to you. So it's a beautiful film.
Yeah, it really is.
Well, that'll take us to the next film on our list, Inside Out 2. The nominated team is Kelsey Mann and Mark Nielsen.
All right. Inside Out 2, the only sequel on our list, actually, and also the biggest animated moneymaker of all time. So I think the list would be a little bit lacking if we didn't include this, if Academy didn't include this for obvious reasons. It connected with the general population on a level that, that no other film, no other animated film this year really did. First time director Kelsey Mann, but also longtime Pixar employee, so it's been there, knows that system. And Pete Docter directed the original Inside Out. We were waiting. I think the public has been waiting for the sequel. We introduce new characters, new emotions in this one. This one, you get anxiety. That's the big, headlining new character. But there's also envy, embarrassment, and ennui. And then later in the film, nostalgia. Probably the most destructive, I would say, of all real emotions. If I had to get on a soapbox and say, but we'll let that go. There was a few years ago when I was working at DreamWorks, we had Pete Docter come and give a talk. And I'll never forget that when he came and gives out, he's now the head of Pixar. He talked about sequels and was asked about sequels. And he said something very interesting. He said, you have to find a way to re-break your main character. And I thought that was a really interesting observation. And when I went and saw this film, I thought about that. And the way they re-break Riley is they introduce this idea of puberty and what it does to her internal psyche, which I think anyone with a kid can relate to, especially when you deal with your child changing right in front of your eyes and over time. And I think it's one of those things that really connected and made sense to a lot of audiences. And you certainly can't deny that they really tapped into the zeitgeist of people today. I think anxiety is a big deal. Like when I see headlines like the most important film you'll see this year, or like as a review sort of, quote, I think that you really are resonating with people. And I think and on that level, they couldn't have predicted that's what it would be. But I think they did a nice job of addressing that.
Kent, I do think one point of order I'm going to bring up,
Oh,
and that's I think that arguably Wallace and Gromit could be considered a sequel as well.
oh, you're right.
True.
That's right. I'm sorry. It is two sequels. You're 100% correct.
When we get to that film, what you said about breaking your main characters in the return, I want to apply some of that logic to that movie and well and see if it's the same approach.
The point of order is taken. I've totally fumbled the ball here, yet revealing my incompetence to be on this panel. But
No,
let's
I mean
let's
maybe
let
it's been
let's
so many years since Wallace and Gromit, though.
let's
But
Camille, you're
Exactly.
saving me here, but let's really be
yeah,
honest. I
I'm
kind of
helping out.
fumbled there. We're gonna give it back to you to save this panel before I embarrass myself any further.
Camille, bring us back. What are your thoughts on Inside Out 2?
Well, I loved it. I mean, I loved the original Inside Out. And this one, as the mother of a preteen, really hit home a little closer than I'd like to admit. But it was great. I loved the new characters. I thought they were fantastic additions. Ennui is my favorite. Um, she was amazing. But one thing I have to say in this film that I really loved, which I don't hear too much about, but it was my favorite part, was the very bizarre 2D animation that appears inside Riley's mind of Bloofy and Pouchy,
Oh yes, I
which
did Bluefy and Pouchy. I forgot about that's great. Thank you for reminding me of Bluefy and the retro.
I almost died. I thought that was the funniest thing I've seen in so long, especially just like coming out of the years of watching like Dora the Explorer and things like that, where it's very much backpack and Dora like getting all the things out of her backpack. And so that for me, it just hit like such a great comedic note. And I also loved to see that 2D animation in a CG film by Pixar because I know they've been kind of developing and playing with different pipelines, and it was fantastic. But yeah, I think story-wise, like this hits home, and like Kent said, anxiety is a huge concern for adults, but for young people, and I think shining a light on like the mental health of our children cannot be underestimated, and it's done in such a beautiful way from Pixar that it opens up conversations and it allows people to kind of explore and discuss things that maybe they don't or they didn't. And so that's where I think this film is important, but it also, takes you along for this really great journey of Riley kind of coming into her own and becoming a teenager and dealing with, all of those feelings at the end of the day. So I just thought it was fantastic.
And it should be noted that this particular film centers around a hockey camp, a 3-day hockey camp. So it's a contained period of time. And I think it continues the tradition of Inside Out 1, which is, and I'm going to say this in a tongue-in-cheek way, the low stakes. Like it's not the end of the world. It's literally going to high school and trying to try out for the high school hockey team and friends from middle school going to different high schools. But it's low stakes for us looking at it as adults, but for the person experience, it's super high stakes.
Yeah,
And I think
super.
contextually that makes sense. They had 9 teenage quote consultants they dubbed the Riley crew, where they would just run the scenarios by them and like how would you react. And I think that's another reason why it resonates is that it feels authentic in terms of the emotional reaction to the things that happen in the film that I think is pretty great. Another thing about ennui creates the sarcasm, which I have to tip a hat for. I love the sarcasm, which I think is pretty great. It's a more of the Pixar, patented Pixar world building where they expand upon the first film. There's this idea of a belief system, and that's how you figure out your sense of self. You hide your secrets in the vault. It makes the idea of how you figure out who you are more complex, which I think is an adult thing to do. So it's like on the cusp of being an adult, but at least still simple enough to be relatable. And I think adults and especially parents get a little chuckle out of those things. This is the most photoreal of all the nominees, besides obviously the stop motion and claymation, but like this is what Pixar is known for in terms of their CG look. Camille, you're 100% correct. They have these 2D characters, which are very charming and bloofy, and but it's still the Pixar pipeline, right? And so this is the thing that almost everybody for at least 10, maybe if not 20 years chased. Like Pixar set the standard for this kind of style of rendering. It's interesting to see them flexing in this film, and it's also an expansion. It's hard to change it a lot if you've already had a movie one, right? Because you have to still connect it to movie one visually. So I think that is part of the reason it's exact. It's kind of like that their look of it. It should be noted too that like they needed this hit. Like they had 175 people get laid off this year. And sadly, right
Mhm.
as this movie came out and became a big hit, it's about 15% of the workforce. And so I'm very happy for them to have a hit. Like I just think we need a Pixar in Northern California, having their own voice apart from Disney. And I'm glad that that happened, and I'm happy for them. This will come up a couple times when we talk about these studios, about the challenges of the animation industry. And 175 people, 15%, that's a lot of people that lost their jobs. And it should be noted
Yeah.
that that is, a traumatic thing, and it's happening across the board, across the industry. And so we want movies to be hits and to resonate with people and remind people why animation is a medium and not a genre, and to like just keep that kind of that light alive.
Yeah. Well, and Pixar is one of the only studios that does the whole pipeline in-house.
Right.
Like that's,
That's a big point in CG animation, like having an in-house team, meaning everything's happening under one roof and not being outsourced to another vendor. That will come up again when we talk about Wild Robot, but is a big deal. Like, so I think that is something to be admired. They are doing their best to stick to that, I think, in these features in the feature animation world. So tip of the hat to them for sure.
Third film on our list, Memoir of a Snail. The nominated team is Adam Elliott and Liz Kearney.
I have so many things to say about Memoir of a Snail. I don't even know where to start. So I had no idea what this film was. And so when I put it on, it is bizarre. It is it is not a story I have ever seen in my life. And I just thought it is one that I have been thinking about constantly since I watched it. It kind of hit some bizarre place in my soul about um just just growing up and the sadness, this melancholy feeling and triumphing over that. I just haven't seen it. It's a very adult film. Like it also
It's rated
wasn't,
R. So it's the
it's rated R,
second
very,
rated R animated film to be nominated after The Great Anomalisa by Charlie Kaufman.
yeah. And so, when you go into this, you kind of have to let it take you for the ride that you are going to go on because you do not know where you're going to go with this one. But it is fantastic. And I love the main character, Grace. She is voiced by Sarah Snook, which
Yeah,
I didn't
Succession
from
fame.
Succession. Um, that I didn't know
Shiv
until
Roy.
afterwards. Yeah, Shiv. And she just brings this tenderness to this character. And so, I really appreciated the very unique storytelling of this film because I I don't recall ever seeing anything like it. And then also the look, this is a stop motion film. When you talk about Inside Out 2 and it had a budget of like $200 million,
That's right.
and a film like this, which was made in Australia, I think the budget was around maybe five. They're just vastly different.
100%.
But I just think the handcraftedness of stop motion animation is so intentional and beautiful that this one really, really stuck with me. I am very curious to hear what you both thought because this for me is a real standout and so interesting. And it hasn't like won, the awards that maybe Flow has or
Yeah.
Inside Out too, but I do think that it's a really beautiful personal film.
It's definitely really beautiful and personal for sure. I read a little bit about the director Adam Elliott and how he came up with this, and apparently he came up with this when his father passed away, and he had to go to his father's house, and I guess his father had hoarded some things, or like it was had collected a bunch of things, and how he resented like having to deal with this, and that sort of inspired this idea of Grace and her love of snails and collecting snail collectibles. So it's literally not about a snail. It's about a human who's obsessed with snails, and it's about her growing up. But it's about a lot of things. It's kind of like every single thing in the movie apparently is connected to something in Adam's life. And at the end of the film, Grace becomes an animator, and sort of that's the end of the film. It has a premiere of her animated film. So I think it's a very personal film for Adam, in that I think these elements all connect to create sort of not an autobiographical, but a very personal film. It is out there. There is a religious cult that her twin brother has to go live with, a family religious cult that tries gay conversion with him, and there's weird fetishism
Yeah,
that she
weird.
marries into. She has a cleft palate, and it is literally about misfits, and I think that that's something that everybody at some point in their life feels a little bit of a misfit. Even the people you don't think feel like misfits. And about getting your confidence. It has an eccentric elderly woman named Pinky who basically becomes Grace's family, and then she eventually suffers from a dementia.
Alzheimer's. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so like there's like the original father in the film was a mime that
In
becomes
Paris,
in Paris, but then becomes disabled and is an alcoholic. So if I told you this is all in one movie, I think you'd think I was crazy, but it is all in this movie. It has a unique look, and it's like if you compare the stop motion claymation of the style of this compared to like Wallace and Gromit, very different look of character design. And it did make a splash when it premiered at Annecy. I remember reading about this, but I think Flow just sort of overshadowed it as an international animated production. And I think that's a shame because this is a pretty cool movie. Like it's definitely something that you would not expect to see, and you kind of have to go along for the ride. And I don't think you know how it's going to end. I think you're watching this and you don't know how it's going to end. And that's one of the great things about this film. It's not predictable in sort of how like you think, oh, that's going to be the thing that's going to now she's going to be happy. Like, oh no, that's not it at all. And like, whoa, wait a minute, what's up with this dude that's like into fetishism? And like so, like these unexpected twists and turns. There's a big giant fire at the at the church. I remember thinking to myself, is this really happening? Like, is this what's going on here?
And her adoptive parents who are like swingers or
Oh, that's right,
something
the
that just
swingers.
like
Like there's
abandoned
swingers in it too. Like
her. Like,
Yeah.
definitely don't
yeah,
watch this with your kid. Okay, like it's not for you.
no,
Yeah,
no,
There's
no,
a lot
no.
of claymation nudity in this film.
yeah, that's
Yeah, there's some
right.
stuff. And I will say like Nick Cave does a little cameo, which
Oh,
I
that's right.
love.
Nick Cave's in it.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
he
yeah.
was one of Pinky's husbands. Uh, very short
That's
scene, but I appreciated it. Um, but yeah, I mean, so many big. You're right. Like, how do you fit all this in one film? But it works,
yeah,
and it just it does. It takes you on such a bizarre ride. And I am glad that it ended the way it ended, because I
yeah,
think the filmmaker did have the intention of maybe making it a little darker. Uh,
yeah. I think
uh,
yeah,
so I
I think
appreciate that
that
that you and you're like, okay, um, that he didn't end it on
yeah,
that kind of
yeah, yeah.
darker note. But
Yeah, we don't want to give it away there.
I'm not going to.
Skid, what did you think?
Well, I do think to that point, there's lots of reasons to think this movie is gonna stay dark. And I thought the ending was probably a very satisfying moment of the film. There's one aspect, though, of the film that didn't land with me as well, and that's the memoir approach, the idea that she's just speaking these things. And then when we get into the twin brother's life, it's from his letters as well, that I felt like a lot of I was being told and then shown.
Ah,
And I think as a narrative technique,
yeah, yeah,
that didn't really pull me in. I think I would have much rather followed the journey
right.
without the sort of framing of the memoir and that she's telling the story.
Ah, interesting.
I found I just wasn't as engaged. Like I felt like someone was like I'm in a very long conversation with someone, and it was not as engaging as I wanted it to be for that. Now, the animation is very interesting, and the story is very interesting, and where they go, it's been very bizarre. All of those things I enjoyed, and I was satisfied at the end. Yeah, you don't have to stay through the credits, but definitely don't turn it off early.
Yeah, you don't have to stay.
You need
There's no
to,
post-credit scene in this one.
but you should watch the whole thing. So it was fun, but yeah, that technique I found it's hard for me to lose myself in that when I felt like it was just sort of being spoken to.
Oh, that's interesting. It's the Robert McKee, no narration, no narrator, right? No voiceover thing. That kind of that bit. I didn't think about that when I was watching it, and especially the switch between when we go to when the two twins are separated, and you go and you see what happens with the brother. It is all through the letters, right? So there is a lot of sort of VO that have voiceover that happens that is sort of breaks the rule of like you show don't tell, right? And they're doing both at the same time. So I think you're right that it maybe undercuts a little bit of the acting of the stop motion animation, right? You see it on their faces and you see what happens, so it's not necessarily, but it is pretty bizarre. Like no matter what, there's a lot of bizarre things that happen in the movie that I can't deny. And I think that the bizarreness is part of what makes the movie interesting, is that it's so bizarre that like, wow, I didn't expect to see this.
I think the movie's worth a watch. I don't know how I would have done it differently. Like again, that is
Mhm.
the structure of the film.
Yeah, yeah.
But that structure, since that is really through the film, like from beginning to end, that's pretty much the voiceover guidance. And yeah, I don't know. I just found myself a little separated because of that.
There was something to be said about if you have the VO from like almost the adult perspective, you know that the character makes it to the end. I mean, it sort of tips your hand a little bit about how it will end a little, just subconsciously. I think you're aware of that fact. I still think I'm glad I watched it. It's an interesting movie. It's probably, to be honest, the most interesting of all the movies, just in terms of like, I am curious what is going on here. Where does this come from? I had a lot of, it's the most untraditional, even though if you compare it to Flow, I think it's still a very untraditional movie for an animated film nominated because of the R rating, because of the complexity and the very strange pitfalls and problems that the characters encounter throughout the whole thing. I had no idea where this was going to go. Zero.
It's fascinating that it is part of this grouping
Right.
Agreed.
of nominated films, and so that for me, I'm like, wow, there are some really interesting choices
Yeah.
to be made this year, and this one is just so out there and so different. I really appreciate it for that fact alone.
Yeah.
And I do love that it is an adult animated film.
Yeah, I think it's great to have that in there where it's like this is one you wouldn't watch. And it's like Anomalisa. You don't want to watch that with your kid. Like that would be a mistake. And I think it's great that they have a film like that since they've only had two R-rated films ever nominated in this category. which I think says a lot about the Academy in terms of like what they tend to like. But because there's always a few R-rated films in animation. Almost always they're international movies. They're rarely domestic release, although Anomalisa was. Or they're independents, right? They're not going to be a major studio's not going to invest that kind of money in an R-rated film and have it come out. I think or rarely do they do. I mean, Sausage Party, I think, was the last
Oh God.
major studio. Well, we won't talk about that. We won't talk about that. Just we don't have time to get into that. Although
I don't think
that
that
is its
was
own unique
nominated.
voice.
I don't think
Yeah.
that was on the
I don't think it
nominated
was
list.
nominated. It was definitely not nominated of the year. Although that one committed to the R rating.
Oh my God, you have no idea.
I mean, like it's great to see that kind of diversity of storytelling, right? That's the most unlike any of the other movies we see on the list here.
And I'm also happy for the film. And I, like you said, I think it's good for the category and the industry that this film's on this list.
Yeah.
100%.
Moving on to the fourth film on our list, Wallace and Gromit, Vengeance Most Foul. The nominated team is Nick Park, Merlin Crossingham, and Richard Beek.
Wallace and Gromit, the longtime standard bearers for Aardman Studios in the UK. They're back with their newest film. They've made 2 features and 4 short films with these characters. They're beloved for this studio. They're a bit of a throwback. The whole movie is a throwback. And that's what's interesting to me about this movie and about these characters is it's sort of timeless in both its rendition and its storytelling. It's an unnamed village in Britain, and these 2 characters, Wallace and Gromit, go on these adventures. Wallace, the eccentric cheese-loving inventor, and Gromit, his loyal anthropomorphic beagle. He walks around on 2 legs, and they do a throwback on this one also to a previous film. The villain in this is Feathers McGraw, the master thief penguin from I think the Wrong Trousers episode. They've been nominated for 6 Oscars. They've won twice for the Wrong Trousers and for Curse of the Were-Rabbit. And this installment, it also features a commentary on technology as an automation and possibly AI. I think it's a little bit of a veiled, not so veiled, pretty obvious commentary on AI because the inventor Wallace creates this takes a gnome and makes a robot out of it called Norbot, and that's the robotic gnome that wreaks havoc on the lives of Wallace and Gromit. The standout scene for me is the submarine sewer action scene is pretty amazing because of the water effects. And like we always talk about water. It seems like every time I got talk with you, Skid, I talk about water.
It's a big deal.
But this great stop motion water this time. But it feels like it has the charm and nostalgia of a bygone era. This is their latest sort of step into that again. And Nick Park is a longtime director at Aardman Studios and sort of keeps the flame alive with this latest version of the characters.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about Feathers McGraw because when I watched it, you
Yeah,
I just think about Feathers McGraw from time to time. That was in 1993, the Wrong Trousers. So when I watched it, I was like, wow, I know this is a bad character. But I'm
it's a bad dude.
I'm kind of digging into my the old memory bank because it's been a while, it's been a minute since that particular film. But yeah, I think they do such an amazing job. I mean, they're just standout stop motion animation. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful what they do. And then the storytelling. I mean, I feel like I've grown up with these characters from the films and the shorts and just such great characters, the bumbling Wallace and then, Gromit just being kind of the one that's pulling it all together.
The fixer.
Actually, yeah, the fixer, like getting it together. I love it. And yeah, I think it does kind of speak to like the future and robots and AI and like a little bit of that futuristicness that's also in Flow and then Wild Robot. But Norbot, yeah, that little gnome is creepy.
Yeah, very creepy.
Very, very creepy. I will say, like, my child was very creeped out by Norbot. Yeah,
Norbot.
so
Okay.
I'm glad it turned out okay. But he was like, I don't know, I don't like those gnomes. I get it.
Yeah, I didn't realize this. The producer of the current film I'm working on lives in London and says, "Oh yeah, gnomes are a big deal in London." I'm like, "Really? That's a thing?" It's like, "Oh yeah, yeah," which explains the animated film Romeo and Juliet and Sherlock Gnomes. Like this explain those films to me a little bit more.
And gnomes are creepy. Let's just get it out there. Like they are little creepy men in the yard. I have one that is in my yard. It is creepy.
The gnome is creepy right to the very end. Like nothing the gnome does redeems the creepy factor, as far as I'm concerned. I'm with you both on
Yeah,
that.
I think he's yeah. I
Yeah,
agree.
gnomes.
The creepiness continues to the end, and the way he talks, he's in a very robotic voice, is very very creepy. One thing I do want to point out, which isn't really related to the film, is Aardman's a unique studio in that it is an employee-owned animation studio.
Mm.
So it went employee-owned in 2018 when the company's founders, Peter Lord and David Sproxton, sold 75% of their own shares to a trust and that holds them for on behalf and benefit of the company's employees. And so they did the dream that I always read about on Cartoon Brew. So like cartoonbrew.com is an industry website. And every time there's talk of like a studio layoffs or like, oh, the studio's doing this to that film or replace the director, there's always this sort of uproar and movement on that website when you see in the comments of like we should start our own studio and then we can determine our own fates. And here is a studio that actually did it. They went through and did it. Sadly, like they had layoffs this year. They had 20 people out of their 425 people that they had to lay off after taking an impairment, which is a loss on their film from 2023, Lloyd of the Flies. I'm glad that this film is being recognized, and I'm glad they're having success with this one because it's not easy to run a studio. I think that's the thing I always come back to when people talk to me, and especially artists talk to me about like, well, do you want to start your own studio, or don't you think people should start their own studio? And my answer to that is like, if you're interested in running a studio, then that's should be your thing. But like as an artist or as somebody who works on these films, I just want to work on movies. Like I don't want to deal with that distribution. I don't want to deal with like funding. I don't want to deal with making payroll and finding a way to do all the things like keeping the lights on. And I think that's a lot of work and it's a lot of stress. And I'm happy for Aardman to have success with this film. I really am. And I think that that's something that is nice to have in the backstory of this movie. Every time they get a nomination, it helps the status of that studio.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just, what you're saying, like the whole industry at large, like over the past couple of years, I mean, it has been a rough ride for animation,
A
you
lot of
know.
contraction. I think the super big expansion over COVID, as it was some of the only content, quote unquote, that could be made remotely. But now, after sort of going back to work and the studios and the streaming and sort of the acceleration of streaming content and the cost of that, being driven by like how much does it actually pay off? I think that there's been a lot of contraction and a lot of people out of work. I know a lot of people that are out of work right now, and it wasn't helped literally by the strikes and the fire and all this other COVID, like post-COVID contraction, the two big strikes, like all those things have hurt the work in terms of like how much work is out there. And they were all like the strikes were for good reasons, but at the same time, there was a real knock-on effect to the industry. And I hope that the fires don't do the same thing. Like I just want to make sure that the productions keep going, and that's just a small aspect of the fires. Really, with so many of our friends who work in the in Los Angeles or have been drastically affected by them, and one hopes that the work can be sustained so they can continue making a living. That really is a case.
Yeah, and I think it's just kind of an overall industry change. But when you have movies like Flow that is made, with Blender, open source software, like I think you will see smaller independent studios start to make, larger projects like this.
Yeah, the barriers to entry have been reduced severely in the last 10 years. Like the cost of like the software and creating quote a pipeline unquote that allows multiple people to work on the same shots at the same time. Those costs have drastically reduced.
Yeah, but it's rough. Like
It's
it is
rough,
a
yes.
huge shift in the industry right now. But I don't know. I think at the end of the day, I mean, people are hungry for stories and these films and short films and series and the things that, the animation community works on. So my hope is that, things are going to get better. It might be different,
Yeah,
but the storytelling will still be there.
100%.
Okay, our final nominated film is The Wild Robot. The nominated team is Chris Sanders and Jeff Herman.
The Wild Robot. So this was one of my favorite films this year. I was really looking forward to this. It's based on a book that many school children read through. my daughter included, and she loved it. And so she had told me all about it. And it's based on the book The Wild Robot by Peter Brown. It's absolutely beautiful. I loved the way DreamWorks kind of again went back to that handcrafted look. I think we talked about it last year with Puss in no,
Puss
what
in
was it?
Boots.
Was it
Yeah.
Puss in Boots too? Okay,
Puss in
yeah, it
Boots.
was,
Yeah. The Puss in Boots 2.
and just kind of how they're pushing the pipeline and so I think, the fact that they had this kind of watercolor aesthetic for all the backgrounds, it really had that handcrafted human touch, despite it, being a CG film. So
Yeah.
that for me was really a standout thing. And then the story. I mean, I think it's a really beautiful story. Again, this kind of futuristic civilization that creates robots, and then this robot ends up on this, uninhabited island, but it's inhabited by all of these animals, eventually learning how to communicate and finding its place there. It doesn't bode well for the future. I mean, I think Flo and Wild Robot, you know, doesn't look good. If I watch these films,
They're
but
not optimistic films about
no,
humanity's future.
no,
No,
I don't know.
probably not.
I don't know. But I thought it was beautiful. Isn't it the last film that DreamWorks is making, front to,
It is
pipeline
the
wise?
final film to be done entirely in-house in Glendale. I think there was some rigging that they outsourced for it. Not on the main characters. I don't think it was on the main characters, but it is the last one. And when we say that, we don't mean that DreamWorks is going away.
No, no, no.
But last year they enacted or announced, I think it was last year, the 30-50 plan, meaning that all movies will either be 30% outsourced or 50% outsourced. And they have a number of vendors they're using, but their biggest deals was with Sony Pictures Imageworks in Vancouver to take advantage of the tax credit, the Canadian tax credit. And I think that was a big blow to all the artists who work in Glendale. And it was a real slap in the face to them. And they were not, I mean, obviously they weren't happy about it. There were tremendous layoffs um, done last year as a result of this. And it's very bittersweet to me to sort of see the renaissance of DreamWorks. Like they had a big hit with the Kung Fu Panda sequel. They were on the rise. They had a hit with Puss in Boots. They had another hit with The Bad Guys, which is getting a sequel, I think this year.
Hmm.
And then to have this come out and get the critical acclaim and the box office dollars, but yet still be moving toward an outsourcing model is really a shame. Like it's a really one of those things where they had one misstep box office wise was with Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken, but you don't always hit a home run, and so like those things happen. And to see what's going on, especially for Camille and I, who have many friends at DreamWorks, it's really heartbreaking. I would like to point out on the positive side, the friends that worked on this film. I just want to recognize co-producer Heather Lanza. She started at Disney, but then came to DreamWorks and rose up through the ranks and is, gets to be the co-producer on this film or earns that right. Editor Mary Blee, who I've gotten to work with on Boss Baby, she literally edited the last sequence I prevised at DreamWorks, the pop-up book sequence backstory of Francis in Boss Baby. She's extremely talented and a super nice person. So I'm so happy that she got to cut this film. And last night she won the Annie for best editing in an animated feature. So when those things happen, you have to be happy. She's married to Kurt Albrecht, who was a producer on Mitchell's versus the Machines, Oscar
Mm.
nominated animated film. So there's a power couple in animation right there. The production designer, longtime DreamWorks production designer, Ramon Zebach. Ramon Zebach's a fantastic person as well. His son is now a production designer. So like,
There's some genes there.
so it's crazy. Chris Zebach is a production designer and artist. And then the cinematographer is Chris Stover, another colleague of mine. It's fantastic. He was the cinematographer on Puss in Boots. So great to see him having this success. It's a beautiful film. The camera works great. I remember watching it, and for a second, I'm like, "Oh, I want to check out the camera work," and it's stunning. It's great. It's really well done. He's now switched over, and I think the head of cinematography overall at Warner Animation under longtime DWA exec Bill Damashki, who's now their head over there. So a lot of great success for people that have been earning it over time. And I'm so happy for them to have this. Chris Sanders, the director of Lilo and Stitch
Yeah.
and co-director of How to Train Your Dragon, and was also co-director or director, I forget which one, on The Croods and Croods 2, right? Both of those, I think. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think both of them. So he's obviously having continued success there. So really, all those people, I'm so happy for them to have this success. And it's a great movie. It really is. It's a fun movie. I remember when the first trailer came out for this film, it was set to the score. It was scored with the Armstrong's "What a Wonderful World," and there was no talking. And for maybe a couple months, all of us in the animation community, does this film have no talking like Flow? Like we were super excited about it. Spoiler alert, there's lots of talking because the animal they switch modes. They actually do a good job of this. I was a little worried about this, but they actually do a great job of when Roz the robot figures out how to communicate with the animals, they switch it to spoken word, and so like you really sort of hear what they're saying to each other. Still great,
Yeah.
still fantastic. I would have loved to have seen that version though, but when
Yeah.
no
Oh,
talking.
the notes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would have been interesting. I do. I think it is such a feather in the cap for DreamWorks Animation, and I think everybody there should feel so proud of this film. It's beautiful, start to finish, and just based on such a great book. I'm really happy that it's gotten the accolades that are well deserved. I was going to say something really poignant, and it's gone now.
Too much talking by me. I blew it for you. I blew it for you. Should have just.
Well, maybe you'll think of what you wanted to say, Camille, when I'm talking. This was my favorite film of the five. Not even arguing from a competitive perspective, but it was entertaining. It brought me right in. It was enjoyable to watch, and then also layered in things to think about and such. That, yeah, it was just. I thought this was a great experience. I strongly recommend the film.
Chris Sanders described the look as a Monet painting in a Miyazaki forest. And I think that's a very appropriate descriptor for it. I think they hit the mark on that. And if you watch the movie so all the human-made things have like sort of classic CG rendering and hard edges and shape design, shape language. And over time, as Roz the robot, voiced by Lupita Nyong'o, and fantastically so, the robot starts to take on this more painterly look. And so over time, you sort of see how in animation, that visual storytelling is super important and really well thought out. And I thought that was a really interesting choice or way to integrate Roz into becoming the wild robot. The transformation of the character, I think, becomes visually supported by those choices. And again, a tip of the hat to Ramon Zebak, production designer, on that choice. I think that's really, really great. Those are little subtext cues that tell you that the character is changing. And I think that's the beauty of animation, that you can have that level of control. It's a beauty, and it's also the curse, right? Where every single decision for the director you have to make every single visual, nothing's for free, right? Everything that's on the screen has been painstakingly and oftentimes multiple times thought about and obsessed over on a level that you don't get anything for free, like a location, even though the location isn't free, but things are made after you've picked it that are already there.
One of the things I really loved about The Wild Robot is it really does deal with important themes again. Like I think there's death, there's the formation of family and what is a family and friendship. And so I think those are really important themes, and so you can have a great conversation with folks after this film, about what those things mean to them, or with children, like what does a family look like, and Bright, because the wild robot ends up Roz raising a duckling named Brightbill, and it's like her son,
Yes.
and
So
letting go,
it is
and
about
just
motherhood. Yes. I
it
think
is about motherhood.
it's
I'm
another
like, tears were shed. Like it was, yeah, because I think you put so much into parenting, and seeing someone literally leave the nest in this film, and just kind of what that looks like. So for me, that was really touching and moving. And I know The Wild Robot is a series of books, and
yeah.
so
Oh,
I
there will
am
be a sequel to this movie.
there better be.
No question. We welcome the sequel to this
I
film.
look forward to watching
Yes.
it.
In terms of its visual language, it definitely is an evolution of Bad Guys, Puss in Boots, like really embracing this sort of different look to it to things. And I have to really applaud DreamWorks for going for it. Like it's not easy for a big studio to change its look. there's a lot of money invested into a pipeline, and being flexible is not one of the strengths of a pipeline, of a very, big pipeline designed for multiple people, like for hundreds of people. So I think that is a testament both to the technology and the artistic side at DWA, that they were able to achieve this film. A tip of the hat. I think it's a great movie. I really, and I think it's, if your scorecard at home, it is definitely a front runner. Last night has swept the Annies, I think 9 Annie Awards, which is the ASIFA, or the Animation Guild's awards. It swept it. But you can't count out Flow. Flow was the early odds on, and then Flow surprised, I think, at the Golden Globes, and one other awards it won. So,
the Golden Globes, that was a shocker.
Yeah, I think people were generally like, wow.
I was like, wait, what is happening? Because I hadn't watched it yet, and that was a surprise.
Yeah. If Wild World was able to pull it off, I'd be so happy for my friends at DreamWorks. It would be their the second Oscar that they've won. I think they won for Shrek. Was it Shrek or Shrek 2? Well, I think it was Shrek that they won the Oscar for. And then this would be the second. And so that'd be a great compliment to a film that is deserving, no doubt about that. And to a studio that I think could use a little bit more of a boost. I would be happy for them.
Yeah, me too.
Any additional 2024 animated features that impressed you guys?
It's funny. I was looking at the list. There are so many international films that I personally have not seen that are probably amazing. So I just want to say that, because there were a lot of films that I think came out of Europe, and they're, just haven't made a splash over here. I think for me, I really enjoyed That Christmas, which was a Netflix
directed
film
by Simon Otto, another DWA alum at Double Negative, DNEG.
I really liked That Christmas. I thought it had it was a very, British sense of humor, very British story, but I think the message about community and just coming together really resonated with me. And so I really enjoyed that one.
Written by Richard Curtis, the famous Richard Curtis. How about that?
Let's watch it. It's on Netflix.
And also Succession alum Brian Cox plays Santa Claus.
So got some Succession.
He doesn't say, "Why don't you go fuck off?" in the thing.
Yeah.
Am I even allowed to say this in the podcast?
He's Santa.
He's Santa. He's Santa Claus in a good way. Don't worry, parents. You can show That Christmas to your kids.
Yes, Santa doesn't say that. I think Ultraman Rising was great.
It's on Netflix, available on Netflix, directed by the great Shannon Tyndall.
Yes,
fantastic filmmaker.
And yeah, there were other really great ones. Those were kind of my two that I really enjoyed as well. But what about you, Kent?
The one that surprised me that I recommend is Look Back. It's an anime, and I think it resonated with me because it was about artists, about two girls. They start off in high school. I guess they're women in high school, and who are competitive with each other, doing their school newspapers manga, and then they become friends, and it's about their friendship. And it's only an hour long. I think it's like literally an hour, so it's a weird length for a feature, right? But I found it very moving, and I think maybe I found it moving because there's this competitiveness between artists that exists, but it's also a camaraderie that develops, and it was something very beautiful about that movie, and I think it's very moving, and I really enjoyed that film. So I would recommend Look Back as an anime and as an animated film. And it also is a little more adult in what happens in the film, and I think it's a beautiful movie. So I would recommend that.
Also glad to have the additional recommendations, and it's been a great year for animated films. I gotta say, this was really fun talking through this stuff. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap. Always a pleasure with you guys. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's been great. Also, always great to be here with Camille Leganza.
So good to see you, Ken. Every time.
That's our 8th episode of Oscar Insights, with more to come. Our goal is to provide you listeners both amusement and enlightenment, and I hope we're delivering in equal measure. We're still on track to release a new episode every 3 days until the ceremony on March 2nd. Subscribe now if you haven't already so you catch them all. As always, I appreciate your feedback. You'll find my contact info on our website, belowtheline.biz. That's B-I-Z. Closing credits, thanks to Curtis Five for our music and John Wan for our logo. The logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. To all of our listeners, I appreciate you. Please rate us wherever you get your podcasts and tell your friends. Thanks again from Below the Line.